Protecting business operations. Let's look at some important terms and concepts that would help a cybersecurity analyst really get your toolkit in order, right? At the end of the day, you need to know certain things in order to get things done. So, this is courtesy of Google, and mind you, a lot of this information comes from Google itself and from the Google Cybersecurity Professional Certification. So a lot of this could even help you prepare for Google's cybersecurity certification. So let's start. This is Dr. Data. So the first one is, of course, it's very famous, called the Security Information and Event Management, or SIEM tools. So SIEM tools basically is an application that collects and analyzes log data. So what happens is every time anything is accessing an application, a network, a software, right, you're collecting logs. You're constantly logging it. So this log data is analyzed all the time in the background to monitor critical activities in an organization. Who's signing in? Did that sign-in work? Where did they sign in from? Which port did they use? Among many different things. So a log, of course, is a record of events that occur within an organization's systems. Depending on the amount of data you're working with, it could take hours or days to filter through log data on your own. Right? So SIEM tools, what they do is they reduce the amount of data that an analyst must review by providing alerts for specific type of threats, risks and vulnerabilities. So what it does is, rather than you passing through millions and millions and millions of lines of logs, instead the SIEM tool basically says any kind of anomaly, if it spiked sometime, if something happened, but what would be the triggers, you have to define it. They do come with some interesting setups nowadays with AI. SIEM tools are getting more advanced and they're integrating AI to say that, okay, let's look at historical data in terms of what is a baseline network access, anything that happens out of the ordinary, something anomalous, it creates a trigger, right? So, but SIEM tools therefore provide a series of dashboards that visually organize data into categories, allowing users to select the data that they wish to analyze. Different SIEM tools have different dashboard types that display the information you have access to. SIEM tools also come with different hosting options, including on-prem and cloud. So where do these SIEM tools get hosted? They can be on-prem, which is in situ, on-site, right, or on the cloud. Organizations may choose one hosting option over another based on the security member's expertise. For example, because a cloud-hosted version tends to be easier to set up, which means you don't need the right infrastructure, don't have to build your platforms, don't have to connect all the systems together. Instead, all your log data is going directly through via the network into the cloud to a managed service provider who's providing your SIEM services, and versus you're going to have an on-prem setup, and then you might say that, okay, we want to manage everything out here, but that could become tricky because you have to constantly upgrade your SIEM tool, get a new license, this and that. Of course, I'm not selling managed services to you, but I'm telling you that managed services are becoming more and more popular because it's less complicated to manage than internal management. Next one is something very important called a network protocol analyzer. They're basically packet sniffers. Why packets? Remember, once upon a time, you used to have switched networks, and then you had packet networks. So the switched networks, when somebody used that network, it was taken over, which means, remember, you used to on your, I don't know if you remember this, but once upon a time, phones used to have these engaged lines. So if somebody was talking on the phone, nobody else could access the phone. No way. But now, as we moved into a digital world, we moved from switching to packet switching, right? From line switching to packet switching. So every piece of data gets broken into small packets, and these packets are transferred separately based on an IP address, And then TCP, which is the cleverer piece, finds the right packet, very much like solving a jigsaw puzzle, puts them together. So this, the network protocol analyzer also is a packet sniffer. So it sniffs the packet, designed to capture and analyze data traffic in a network, which means it keeps a record of all the data that the organization's network encounters. And then you'll hear about some common protocol analyzers, packet sniffer tools, but nonetheless, it looks at every single packet to understand where is it coming from, what's the header, what is the footer, is there anything in the body, is there an attachment, among many different things, right? To figure out, is this malicious, is this unknown? That's why sometimes you'll even figure out, right, is this an external sender? Could this be something that could be dangerous? So that's what they do. Packet sniffers sniff packets. Next is something called a playbook. What's a playbook? A playbook is basically a step-by-step set of instructions, right? It's a manual that provides details about any operational action, such as how to respond to a security incident. Organizations have multiple playbooks documenting processes and procedures for their teams to follow. So it basically tells you, if then do this, then do that. Then if that happens, then do this. Think of it as a massive flow chart that tells you all the steps you need to follow. Why? You create a standard operating procedure. So playbooks, of course, vary from one organization to the next, but they all have one single purpose: to guide the analyst through a series of steps to complete specific security-related tasks. Now consider the following scenario. You're working as a security analyst for an incident response firm. You're given a case involving a small medical practice that has suffered a security breach. Your job is to help them with the forensic investigation, so it's ex post, after the fact, and provide evidence to a cybersecurity insurance company, because cyber insurance is becoming very, very popular. They will then use your investigative findings to determine whether the medical practice will receive their insurance payout if there's been a breach. So very much like an audit. So in this scenario, playbooks would outline the specific actions you need to take to conduct the investigation. They ensure that you're following the proper protocols and procedures. When working on a forensic case, there are two playbooks you might follow. The first playbook you might consult is called the chain of custody playbook. Right? Very much like chain of custody, you've seen these in police drama. It's the process of documenting evidence possession and control during an incident life cycle. Who had what? Who controlled what? Who knew what? As a security analyst involved in forensic analysis, you'll work with computer data that was breached. You and the forensic team will need to document who, what, where, and why you've collected the evidence. That evidence is your responsibility and it's in your possession. Right? Once it's your possession, you have the chain of custody. Evidence must be kept safe and tracked. Make sure there's integrity, there's confidentiality, there's availability, always. The CIA triad, CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Every time evidence is moved, it should be reported. This allows all parties involved to know exactly where the evidence is at all times. Very much like creating an audit trail. The second playbook your team might be using, so one is, of course, chain of custody. It's called Protecting and Preserving Evidence Playbook. So rather than the first one, so while the first one is looking at chain of custody, who, what, when, where, right? You're looking at protecting and preserving evidence. So this is the process of properly working with fragile and volatile digital evidence. As a security analyst, understanding what fragile and volatile digital evidence is, along with why there is a procedure, is critical. As you follow the playbook, you'll consult the order of volatility. So volatility is which is the data that could disappear. So things that can disappear quickly is more volatile. So which is the sequence outlining the order of data that must be preserved from first to last. It prioritizes volatile data, which is data that might be lost if the device is powered off, regardless of the reason. While conducting an investigation, improper management of digital evidence can compromise and alter that evidence. When evidence is improperly managed during an investigation, it can no longer be used. For this reason, you have to properly preserve the data. You do it by making copies, conducting your investigation, creating image snapshots. When I say image, it's creating a computer image of exactly what is going on before you turn off the machine or kill an application. You need to know that before you do anything that might endanger the forensics in any shape or form. And that becomes a part of the protecting and preserving evidence playbook. Next one, you've got Incident Vulnerability Response Playbook. So this is IRP, right? Incident Response Planning. How do you plan incidences and what happens if there's a vulnerability? How do you work with that? So incidents and vulnerability playbooks are commonly used by entry-level cybersecurity professionals. They tell you how to manage business continuity, which is basically how do you keep the company operating as normal, even if there's been a disruption. So these two types of playbooks are similar, that they both contain predefined up-to-date lists of steps to perform when responding to an incident. Following these steps is necessary to ensure that you as a security professional are adhering to legal and organizational standards and protocols. These playbooks also minimize errors, so you know that what actions need to be done, who does it, when they need to be done. So whenever an incident, threat, or vulnerability occurs or is identified, the level of risk to the organization depends on the potential damage to its assets. So higher chances of damage to an asset, the higher the risk. The basic formula for determining the level of risk is that risk is the likelihood of a threat and the impact. So you multiply that. It's also called a value at risk model, right? So sense of urgency is essential. Following the steps in the playbook is very important because mishandling the data can compromise any kind of forensic investigation and even render it unusable and make your insurance void, especially cybersecurity insurance or cyber insurance. So common steps: how do you prepare, right? What do you detect? What do you analyze? How do you contain? How do you eradicate? And how do you recover? So once again, start by preparing. How do you detect a problem? How do you analyze that problem? How do you then contain a problem, which is how do you isolate it or quarantine it? And then how do you eradicate it? How do you mitigate the problem? And then how do you recover back for continuity purposes? Then of course because it's very, very important to realize that a lot of data also means a lot of parsing. In order to parse, you need to get a sense of some important operating systems, some programming languages, and of course databases. And for that reason, we'll talk a little bit about SQL, Linux, and Python. So Linux, of course, is open source, is publicly available operating system. Unlike other operating systems such as Mac OS or Windows, Linux relies on a command line as primary user interfaces. And of course, there are graphical user interfaces for Linux too, but mainly it's a CLI or a command line interface. It's not a programming language, it's the operating system, right? So it's used as text-based command between the user and the operating system. Common use of Linux for everyday security analysts is examining logs for better understanding what's going on in the system. You might be using commands to review error logs, and you use things like touch and sudo all the time when investigating uncommonly high network traffic, creating users, taking off users, among many different things. Then of course, SQL is structured query language. It's a programming language used to create, interact with, and request information from a database. And of course, a database is organized collection of data so that you can query through things very quickly. Might be millions of points in a database, so entry-level analysts would use SQL. Everything from creating things using create statements, insert statements, alter statements, to of course running queries, which typically has the form which is select something from some table where certain conditions are met. So it's always select from where, right? So, and then the last thing is Python as a programming language. Security professionals use Python to perform tasks that are repetitive and time consuming, but require a high level of detail and accuracy. So web vulnerability, of course. So let's talk about some interesting basic setups. Web vulnerability is a unique flaw in a web application that threat actors could exploit by using some kind of malicious code or behavior to allow unauthorized access, data theft, malware deployment. OWASP is very famous for providing the critical risks to various different things, especially web applications. And of course, if you visit them, you can find the top 10. Antivirus software, of course, is software used to prevent, detect, and eliminate malware and viruses. It's also called anti-malware. It can, so the more sophisticated ones can even scan the memory of the device to find if something is being persistent, if something is even being logged in. So, of course, perpetrators find a way to escape or bypass systems. The question for antivirus sophistication depends on how deeply it can understand and how entrenched it is into the system itself to figure out if there is presence of malware. IDS stands for Intrusion Detection System. Is an application that monitors system activity and alerts on possible intrusions. So it's called Intrusion Detection System. It's like a perimeter guard, right? Like a coast guard or somebody who stands at the border or border post. So the system scans and analyzes network packets which carry small amounts of data through networks. The small amount of data makes the detection process easier for an IDS to identify potential threats to sensitive data. So whether somebody's trying to infiltrate, which is access, or exfiltrate, steal, they can figure that out, right? So they call constantly, again, very much like packet sniffers, they are analyzing network packets to figure out, okay, what seems to be a threat vector? Is something that shouldn't be moved out of the organization being moved out, exfiltration? Is something that shouldn't be accessing the organization, accessing it, infiltration, right? So it's important to understand that. Encryption, of course, is, there's a very famous phrase which says that the loss of possession does not automatically mean the loss, or should not automatically mean the loss of confidentiality. So the whole idea is, it might fall in the wrong hands, but just because it's fallen in the wrong hands doesn't mean they should be able to read it. So what encryption does is it makes data unreadable and difficult to decode for unauthorized users. Its main goal is to ensure confidentiality of private data. So it's a process of converting, or it's called enciphering, from a readable format to a cryptographically encoded format. And this is called enciphering, and decryption is the way to break it from the encoded format into a readable format, which is called deciphering. So cryptographic encoding is converting plain text, which is normal readable sets, into something called a secure ciphertext. And then plain text is unencrypted information, and the secure ciphertext is the result of encryption, and deciphering is bringing it back into plain text. Penetration testing, which is also called pen testing, you'll hear this all the time, is the act of participating in simulated attacks that helps identify vulnerabilities in systems, networks, websites, applications, and processes. It's a thorough risk assessment setup, right, or mechanism that can evaluate and identify internal and external threats as well as weaknesses. So what you're trying to do is trying to penetrate the system to see if things are secure. The best way to know if something is working is to try and break it by yourself. And that's what they do. And this is a part of white hat hackers who try to break through the system. Right? Of course, this brings us into this very interesting area of adversarial AI and emerging trends. So adversarial AI, so adversary is an enemy, right? Somebody who does a counterpoint to you. So it's a technique that manipulates artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies to conduct attacks more efficiently. There are new things that are happening every single day. Adversarial AI is trying to break through systems by even understanding patterns, creating attacks, creating new attack vectors on new attack surfaces, which is what you're going to hit, and attack vectors are how you're going to hit it. So AI is playing a huge role, especially adversarial AI. Next thing to know is something called phishing, which is using voice to phish, which is impersonating a known person's voice. And of course using AI to create a voice replica and subtly requesting money or requesting some personal information as if somebody that you know is requesting that from you. Residual risk is not the thing, which is it's a methodology or a process for calculating and managing the risk that remains in an organization after you've implemented all the controls to mitigate the risk. Right? So you can use the best control, but some risk will always be there. That's called residual risk. You're always trying to reduce that. So then of course you've got a huge area which is developing rapidly, which is called DevSecOps. So developer-based security operations. It's a framework that integrates security into every stage. It's called shift left of the software development lifecycle. It's an approach that organizations use to reduce the risk of releasing code with security vulnerabilities. So shift left is a DevSecOps principle that encourages software engineers to move security to the beginning of the development process. That's why it's called shift left, move it to the beginning. This allows teams to identify and address security risks early. Collaboration, of course, between development, operations, governance, security teams, end users. Key components using continuous integration and continuous delivery, which is called CI/CD. They use automation, security testing, and collaboration to get it done. Then, of course, how on earth do you do security hardening, which is how do you secure an organization's digital assets using a variety of techniques to harden it from being broken into? Of course, you've got things like patching. You've got to apply patches and updates regularly. We have to have software patches and software updates for your operating system, your applications, every other device, even firmware updates for hardware. Limiting access, which is a principle of least privileges, which we'll talk about in a second. So you're trying to limit user privileges and access. Give people the lowest level of access. Only let them access something if they can prove who they are. So don't trust anybody. That's the motto. Disabling unnecessary services. Don't let other things run in the background if you don't know what they are. Encrypting data. Make sure that you are maintaining confidentiality by encrypting the data that you want to protect. Configure your firewalls and intrusion detection systems so that they're up to date. Enforce strong authentication mechanisms, especially multi-factor and multi-device authentication. And then adhering to policies such as zero trust, don't trust anybody, principle of least privilege, or defense in depth, where you secure everything and audit things all the time. Do we have physical security? Are the people secure? Do they have the right training? Are the processes secure? Or do we do things the right way? And are the technologies secure? Are we applying the right updates and choosing the right technologies that are less vulnerable? Then, of course, workforce training, which is you have to implement workforce training. It's crucial. Segmenting resources. You've got to segment resources so if one is breached, it doesn't automatically spill over to something else. So as if you're creating parameters, as if you're creating resource subnets, right, where you're separating them so that they don't automatically spill over and creating air gaps. And resetting default passwords, forcing oftentimes to reset default passwords without which you don't have any kind of access. Thank you very much.